This is the fourth and final mystagogical musical musing on the texts and chants of major elements that the congregation will sing in the order of Mass. What I'd like to treat is the Agnus Dei, that is the litany that's sung during the fraction rite at communion. My treatment's going to be a little bit different than the other three that I've done. I'm not going to spend so much time just exploring the meaning of the text. Rather, I'd like to talk with you about how this ritual act, text and gesture combined, really works on very, very deep levels. I want to suggest to you that what we have is an anthropological level or a human level of ritual behavior, which has become transformed with historical meaning by our Jewish ancestors in the faith, and then in turn given further historical meaning in Christian understanding. So we've got at least three layers operating. Let me give you an example. At human level, we have something called a lunar quadration. That's the way we scholars talk. Most people would call it a week. In other words, the cycle of the moon gives us 28 days. If you cut it down into 4 parts, you get 7 days. That's a quadration, and there's a 7-day week. Now, how are you going to mark that 7-day week off? Well, you can do one of two things. You'll either mark the beginning of it, or you'll mark the end of it. And that's fundamentally what human beings will do. They'll mark either the beginning or the end. That's the anthropological level, if they're paying attention to the lunar cycles. Now, what did the Jewish people do with this? Well, they took what's fundamentally a human act of looking at a lunar cycle of time, and they gave it a historical grounding. In other words, they marked the end of the 7-day week, and they called it Shabbat, a word that probably meant to cut or to mark a boundary. Shabbat would start on a Friday evening at sunset and would last through all of the 7th day, that which marked off the end of this 7-day period, and would last until sunset of that day. And special activities marked that time. You were not to be involved in the regular kind of work that you would do the other 6 days of the week. Now, notice that within the Jewish scriptures, the Genesis narrative tells us all about the foundation of Shabbat. And in fact, the priestly narrative of creation makes it very clear that God's self, is even involved in the keeping of Shabbat. For 7 days, God works in the creation narrative, but on the 7th day, he rests from all his work and sees that everything he has created is very good. Now, what did Christians do? Christians also saw this lunar calculation of a 7-day week, but rather than marking the end of the week, relatively quickly they began to mark the beginning of the week, the first day of the week. They in fact gave it a new name. They called it the Lord's Day. And at the beginning, rather than having all of the themes of the Shabbat, of rest from work, Lord's Day was a work day. You had the thematic of being along with the God of Genesis, starting the new creation. Why? Because Jesus of Nazareth had risen from the dead on the first day of the week. And if he was the sign of the new creation, well, we Christians should likewise be involved in the new creation on this first day of the week, when we especially remembered his risen life. Do you see the moves from human celebration to Jewish transformation to Christian transformation? Now I'm going to speak specifically about the Lamb of God and its foundation. At the human level or anthropological level, what we're really looking at are two different things in the ancient world. The first was a gleaning of the flocks before breaking camp. When folks were nomadic, when they kept a winter versus a summer area for caring for their flocks, frequently the newborns would be gleaned from the flock. There'd be a decision made about which of these animals were really strong enough to make it through the trip to the summer fields. And so you would want to travel by night. You'd want to have the most light you could possibly get. You didn't want to travel during the day. It was simply too hot. So when would you go? You'd go when you'd have a full moon. So it's not for nothing that there'd be all sorts of customs where at the spring equinox, and especially at the full moon after the spring equinox, that would be the sign that you'd break camp, winter camp, and move as a group of nomads to the new pasturage for the spring. That's ceremony number one. The second ceremony will strike us as a little odd. It's the covenant ceremony. The krith brit is what it's called in Hebrew, the cutting of the covenant. See, they didn't say signing a covenant or making a covenant. They said to cut a covenant. Strikes us as kind of odd. Well, here's the ceremony. Suppose that two kings who had been at war with each other made a covenant ceremony that said, we're now going to live in peace. There'd be an entire structure, just like today there would be a treaty structure set up between nations at war. There was a treaty structure set up in the ancient world, but there's also ceremonies that went along with it. After identifying who the parties were and recounting what their history was and setting up the stipulations of the covenant and setting up blessings and curses, finally there would be a covenant ceremony in which the two kings would ask their servants to choose an animal, ox, sheep, goat, and bring the equivalent of a machete and hack the animal in half, and then hold these dripping, bloody pieces apart, and the two kings would walk through the midst of those slaughtered animals, and as they walked through, they would make the gesture, if ever I break this covenant with you, may that be done to me. Do you begin to see how intense that ceremony was? It's certainly much more intense than simply signing a little contract. That was the cutting of the covenant. Okay. So if that's the anthropological or human substructure, how did this become historiated? How did the Jewish people bring their history to bear? Well, think about the Exodus from Egypt and the Passover lamb. The slaughtering of the lamb was connected to the breaking of camp for nomads. You gleaned the flock, and one of the things you did was hold the feast then. And that's precisely what you did. If a family didn't have enough members, you brought in other members, and all together ate this lamb. But notice, the blood of the lamb marked the doorposts. It became a way, according to the Exodus text, of allowing God to pass over those places that had been marked by covenant under his protection. You begin to see that the themes of this human world, these symbols, are being very brilliantly brought together by Jewish thinkers and connected to their own experience in history of leaving Egypt. Now we jump. Imagine what it was for the followers of Jesus after his death. Imagine what it was for them who had completely given themselves over to his message and his person, who had believed him to be the fulfillment of all the promises made to Israel, who believed him to be their hope and their future, and then discovered that he was condemned by the religious and political authorities of the day, tortured and murdered. Their hopes were dashed. How could they make sense of this absolutely scandalous act? Now, in the light of the resurrection, some Christians had brilliant theological insights. They began to reread their own heritage and get new insights into what the Jewish heritage was teaching them. And one of the things they figured out was, it might just be possible to think of this slaughtered man, this naked, tortured body, torn apart on the cross, in the light of the slaughtering of the Paschal Lamb. Just as the Lamb and its blood marked the covenant made between God and Israel, a covenant that protected them and brought them from slavery in Egypt to freedom in their own land, so the blood outpoured by Christ marked the new and eternal covenant between God and humanity that brought people from slavery to sin and to the freedom of grace. Now let's make one final jump. What we claim is that the sacrifice of Jesus, this bloody sacrifice of the cross, is the final sacrifice. In a very hallowed phrase from Catholic theology, we declare that the Mass is the unbloody representation of the bloody sacrifice of the cross. So it's not for nothing that at the time of the fraction rite, the priest will hold on high the consecrated host and break it. Break it, in fact, into many smaller particles. And while that's taking place, we sing the chant, Lamb of God, you who take away the sins of the world, have mercy on us and grant us peace. We are once again caught up in the covenant ceremony, no longer limited to just the first full moon after the spring equinox. But the power of that covenant ceremony renewed every time we celebrate the Holy Eucharist. Listen to the chant. Lamb of God, you take away the sins of the world. Have mercy on us. Lamb of God, you take away the sins of the world. Have mercy on us. Lamb of God, you take away the sins of the world. Grant us peace. I think you can tell that the chant is beautifully adapted from what the Liber Usualis calls Mass 18. Those of us of a certain age can actually remember this as part of the Requiem Mass, when we did not sing Miserere Nobis and Dona Nobis Pacem, but rather Dona Nobis Pacem or Dona Eis Pacem, grant to them, or even to him or to her peace, and then concluded peace eternal, sempiternam. So we'd modify the concluding part of the litany depending on the circumstances in which Mass was celebrated. But I would like to conclude by singing this in Latin, and you can see how the chant is perfectly adapted from the Latin original. Agnus Dei, qui tollis peccata mundi, miserere nobis. Agnus Dei, qui tollis peccata mundi, miserere nobis. Agnus Dei, qui tollis peccata mundi, dona nobis pacem. How wonderful that we would end this prayer. Grant us peace.